Hi friends, this is Ray Lutz with Citizens Oversight, and I managed to not press the record button in our earlier conference call. So I'm going to go over the material that we did discuss as a group and cover it because I know a lot of other people want to also see what we did conclude there. Now this first set is about the issue of the conditional, what they're calling now conditional voting versus provisional voting. And it used to be that as a provisional voter, if you went in and there was just a very few reasons, if you didn't have your vote by mail ballot with you to surrender at the polling place, then you would need to become vote provisionally. They put it in an envelope, have you sign it, and then it is processed at the end because they need to know if that ballot didn't come in, maybe you voted accidentally, you may have voted by mail, and the by mail ballot would then have to be fully processed so they can see did you vote or not. And if you didn't vote, then they would then process that provisional vote. So you're already a registered voter, and they just need to have you vote provisionally because you go to your polling place, you don't have your ballot to surrender, and then you vote there in person. They put it in the provisional envelope, and it isn't processed until the end. There is the other case, which is, excuse me, there's another case where if you went to your polling place and they didn't have you on their roster, because in the old days you could only vote at the polling place where you were listed. And if you didn't go in there, then probably they didn't see you on the list. Yeah, you might be a legitimate voter, but since we're not sure, we're going to let you vote and then put you in a provisional envelope. You sign it, and then they process it later to see if you were actually a legitimate voter at that place. Now, you're not the vote by mail problem. Were you a voter at all? So it's a little bit different case. And then there is the case where if you wanted to vote as, say, and this is the issue right now, is if you're in a primary and you want to vote as in a different party. Now, it used to be that you could not register in a new party that day. This is now changed. You can register that day for either to affiliate with a different party or to become registered for the first time. And then if you are registering for the first time, then that's a little bit different condition than, yeah, you may have already voted. So they're now separating these two types of things into two groups. One is the provisional votes that have to be held to the very end to know if you had voted some other way. And the conditional, what they're now calling the conditional voting, where you are registering for the first time, or you want to change your party affiliation that day, and then they need to check your address and so forth, the normal checks for registration before they accept your ballot. So that normal checks, that can be handled faster and doesn't have to wait to the end if you are a new voter or somebody that just wants to change your registration. So those are now being called conditional voting. So there, in this thing here that you see, conditional voter registration, a voter that's either a new voter who's voting, register and votes on election day, or a voter who wants to change their party and then vote on election day. Those are now being grouped into this conditional voting. We were looking at this thing here, which is if for getting provisional ballots, if you're on the rolls appearing to vote and in theory could have voted already in the place that you are on the rolls, a poll worker cannot know that they're legally, and then that was provisional. This was the old way. Now we're going to be using electronic poll books where you they're all linked up electronically and through the internet. So when you come in, not the voting part, but just the checking on whether you are a voter or not. This is a good thing to check so that we don't have any chance of voter fraud. Okay, voter fraud is when voters vote more than once or in two different places under different names, all this sort of shenanigans that could happen to try to get more votes in by the voter. And election fraud is when stuff happens by the either election officials or some insider to change the votes inside the election, has nothing to do with the voter. So those are the two types of things that are sometimes all spoken as like voting fraud or voter fraud, and they're two different things. Voter fraud is about voters and whether you're doing stuff on the front end, and election fraud is more of the back end. So in the old days, if you were not on the rolls at that particular polling place where you showed up to vote, then they wouldn't have all the rest of the records. So then they wouldn't know, okay, I can't check up on this person, so let's let them check up on them another place. So that can be done, and they would give them a provisional. However, if they're registering for the first time, it really doesn't need to wait till the end. So if you're on, another case is if you're on the as a vote by mail voter on the rolls, and you presume to be sent a mail ballot, and maybe you turned it in. So then they have to wait for that mail ballot to potentially be completely processed to see if you did vote that way. And if not, then they take this provisional ballot and go ahead and process it and approve it. So the provisional, the provisions for stopping a provisional ballot are not whether or not you're registered or not. It's whether or not you've already voted generally. And now they've eliminated most of those reasons, and provisionals will be given only to voters that are vote by mail but want to vote in person at a voting center, but the poll worker is not able to know if the mail ballot has been received by the registrar's office. Now, when they receive a vote by mail ballot, the first thing that happens is they go through this very large machine that sorts it. I'm sorry, they don't sort it right away. They put it in the big machine, and all it does is just scan the front of the envelope, which says your name. It has a barcode, your number, and your signature. And it photographs that and lets the operator at their workstation take a look at that signature and see if it matches what they have on file, either from the DMV records or the signatures that you've used before. There's usually a few different ones that they look at. And if they approve it, and some of this is done in a black box, it's just a signature comparison, and it's not an operator opinion. If you get approved that your signature matches, then it goes on to the second step. And the second step, it goes through that same machine, but this time it slits open the top of the envelope and sorts it in by usually down to about 30 different places in a county. And I know that in San Diego, they sort them by city council districts so that they can get to them. But in each one of those districts, there may be, potentially hundreds of precincts. So they don't sort them all the way down to the precinct. And then they put them in batches of 400. And the envelopes are in bins that are all opened, but the ballot's not taken out and all grouped together according to this fairly rough grouping. Then they move that over to a room where the ballots are taken out, briefly inspected to see if they're not damaged or that there's no personal information such as signatures and the like on them. And if there is any personal information like that, then they have to be remade into one that doesn't have that, which will be the one that would go through the system. So those remade ones would be set aside. But at that point, once you go through that second step, that second part of the machine, and accepted, cut off, and moved over into the take the ballot out of the envelope phase, there's no way to pull it back. So those people have already been basically processed, and they will be put through the counting process even though they're not counted yet, and they may be delayed until a later part, like before, closer to the election, before they actually are run through the machines for counting. So those essentially those set of ballots there, if you came in to a polling place and were a vote by mail voter and you said, okay, I did put my ballot in, but I don't want to use that one. I want to vote here instead. Well, there's a chance that they could accept your ballot anyway if your vote has not been processed yet. They could say, we're going to now give priority to the polling place ballot and cancel out the vote by mail ballot. They would have to receive your ballot later. Their vote by mail ballot would have to come in later so that it wasn't fully processed, and then therefore they could block it so that you could have your in-person vote taken. So there's that chance that that might happen there. So the provisionals now are reduced in concept so that only voters whose mail ballot has been received will be given a provisional. So we know that your mail ballot has been received. They can show that on their system. Yeah, your mail ballot has been received, so you're going to get a provisional because just to make sure we have it covered. But we show that we've already received it. Here's an important part. Any mail voter whose mail ballot has not been received as voted can cancel their mail ballot and vote in person. Now, this is primarily, I believe, for Los Angeles. I don't know if every district is doing this in California, but this is an important new, I guess, option for a voter who might have, put their vote by mail ballot in and then says, gee, I want to vote in person. Or, if they find out, gee, your vote by mail ballot has already been submitted, they can say, well, I never did send it in. I want to vote in person. And the person is there. They could cancel it if it hasn't been fully processed. Any mail ballot received by the registrar from them subsequently will be discarded because the voters in person are voting is on record. So this is the point, is that they would have to not have received that vote by mail ballot and process it in that first phase where they then approved it and put it in, slid it open, and taken the mail ballot out. There's no way to put it back in and stop it at that point. So now they're saying, and this is from Dean Logan, and Mimi Kennedy was on the line explaining this, that if there are many provisionals in Los Angeles County, that will be evidence of some widespread attempt to steal the vote by mail ballots without voters' knowledge. There are such schemes that could go on where, because now what they're doing is they're sending out a mail ballot to almost everybody. Like anybody who says that they might want one, or just as a default, they send it out. And so they're not basing the control of the ballots based on, only sending one to those people that absolutely want one and then they can't get a ballot there. What they're doing is making the ballots really easy to get. So you might have one in your hand. You might, I don't think they're going to be getting two. But potentially, even if you don't want it, you may be getting the vote by mail ballot. That's the point. And so then you can say, well, what used to be you had to bring that into the polling place and surrender it and say before you got into the mix of the real ballots. Now what they're saying is, okay, what we'll do is we'll cancel out any vote by mail ballot that you may have put in if it hasn't been received. You don't have to bring in your ballot then because you never did mail it. And then you can vote conditionally. But conditional, you wouldn't have to be in provisional then at all, because then they see, okay, this person is voting in person. We're just going to mark the record electronically to say this one is going to dominate any ballot that may have been sent in or maybe future sent in by mail. So essentially what they're doing is they're moving the provisional control from the front of the ballot and send it in anyway to an electronic control where they're going to be checking electronically whether you have done it or not and then marking it electronically that this one is going to dominate, instead of doing it through a paper mode of process, which is to put it in the envelope. I think that's a fair way to interpret it. Now, conditional happens when you're doing either same-day registrations or a change, either you're registering for the first time or you want to change your party affiliation. And I think a good way to look at this party affiliation thing is really that way. You're affiliating with the party. You don't have to say, like, I'm becoming a Democrat or I'm becoming a Republican or whatever the party is. You don't have to change who you are to affiliate with the party. You're just saying, I'm going to be voting along the lines of what, and getting the ballot for this party. You're affiliated, and it doesn't change who you are. And that can maybe make it a little bit easier for people to affiliate. Now these new things, which is called conditional ballots, those are for same-day registrations, and they're processed on a flow basis as received during the 10 days of voting ahead of Election Day, and then during the canvass, which means the counting process, for those cast on Election Day. So essentially, if you come in and you say, I'm already registered or I'm a new registration, but I want to either register for the first time or change my registration, then you become a conditional. It doesn't have to wait to the end to see if some other ballot is processed, because that isn't the issue that they're dealing with here. They're dealing with what your registration is, and there may actually be an issue where, let's leave out new registrations, because of course those people could not have voted any other way. But if you were changing your registration, then you might also have to become a provisional at this point as well, if you want to change your affiliation and you may have voted by mail ahead of time. That may put you back in the provisional slot. But essentially, they've reduced the number of provisionals by separating these two, and also, increasing the number of conditional voting, because those will be for everybody who wants to register to vote or change their party affiliation on the election day or during the process. They said these ballots will not have to wait until mail ballots are all processed and will not be held to the end of the canvass, as the provisional ballots were in the legacy precinct model. Well, they just separated it into two groups. They could have done this before and said, for any of those conditions where we're not concerned about whether or not you voted somewhere else, we don't have to wait till the very end. So this is good that they've separated this out and actually are going to be merging those conditional ballots in. So now they're saying conditional voter registration will be available up to and including on Election Day at all vote centers and at the office of the registrar and county clerk. Now, that's in LA. In LA, it is the county clerk is also the registrar, but in other counties, it may not be that way, and they may not handle it the same way. But it is a law in California that you're supposed to be able to change your party affiliation or register for the first time to vote. It is also the law that they don't have to include all those people in the election, but I can guarantee this: if it's close, then all of those will be scrutinized and put in if it gets close. But if it's a landslide victory, one way or the other, and those are not going to sway it one way or the other, it really doesn't matter if they complete those. But it is good because they've had these sort of registration scams, if you will, where people want to make it really hard to register. You got to do it a month in advance, and if you happen to miss it, they go, yeah, you could vote, but you should have remembered to register a month ago. And you're going, okay, well, blow it off then if they're going to be so difficult to work with. So now we have change this law so that you can register on the very day of voting. This is a really good step in the right direction. And I'm proud of that California did move in this direction. So they're doing some of the right thing here. Okay, so going on, regarding voter requests to discontinue or remove permanent vote by mail status on their registration or to simply opt to vote in person in lieu of using an issued vote by mail ballot, they will not have to register conditionally for that purpose. No, those are just changes to your registration or where you're voting. You don't have to re-register. So that's a good point. The mail ballot for a given election can be suspended at the vote center without surrender and a regular ballot issued. Now, remember that in LA, and this is important, they're going to use ballot marking devices, which are electronic machines that you will scroll through and hopefully understand how to get through the ballot. There's some concern there because they only show 4 at a time. There's a more button at the bottom, and there's also a next. So people may click next and not get through all of the possible things. They don't have it set up, so you have to scroll through all of the basically to the bottom of the contract, if you will. And you know, most or many websites, for example, where you go in and they say you have to agree to the contract, you have to scroll to the bottom of the contract at least and sort of show that you may have read it. And they don't require that. So you could see maybe the first 4 contestants and not really realize that there's 12. And that there's the guy that you really sort of heard about down in there somewhere that you wanted to vote for, but for some reason it looks like he's not on the ballot. You hit next, and when you see your ballot summary card that comes out for your review, yeah, it shows you who you voted for. It doesn't show everybody else that you didn't vote for. So this you can't fully verify that you were not shown, that you decided not to vote for all those other ones. You do see that on a regular hand-marked paper ballot, the kind you get in the mail if you vote by mail. So there are some good things about voting by mail, I think, because it lets you see all the options for sure, and that your little hand is coloring in that small bubble of the person that you want to do it in, and that for sure you're having feedback that you're voting for that person. Whereas a voting marking device is a little bit more distant. Yeah, you select it. You can't overvote, which is good. There's no way that the overvote can happen. And reading the ballots is done through a barcode, which is not human readable. And that's something that we can check on, though, to show that the items that you were shown actually corresponds to the barcode. So I don't think there's going to be any horseplay in coming up with a different barcode that doesn't match what the selections are, because that'll be something that's checked. So when you check those selections, those are the ones that the barcode will correspond to and that you will be voting for. Now the issue is with Los Angeles, I will point this out again, we talked about on the phone call, and as I said, I neglected to record it. The problem is that you also have to then transfer, the new voting machines in LA do not actually scan and record the scan at the polling place. So we have to have those taken very carefully, and the chain of custody has to be pristine from the polling place back to the central offices, which is where they're counted. So we have to now watch that in Los Angeles more so than in other counties where they're scanned at the polling place and locked into electronic form and in a way that they can't be altered. Now let's see here. Conditional registration would be only necessary for newly registered voters or if an existing voter was changing their address or party preference. Yeah, so this is not because they may have voted in a different place. So let's talk about the other issue, which is getting a crossover ballot. And this has come up with people who want to vote for Bernie Sanders, for example, and a lot of them are nonpartisan voters because Bernie Sanders has been a nonpartisan, and some of them have left the party out of, maybe they were affiliated with the Democratic Party and then left because they were so upset. Well, you can either become affiliate again with the Democratic Party, which I still recommend, and I assert that, think about it, that you're affiliating with the party and not becoming a Democrat. There's 2 different ways to look at it. and so that you're not feeling like you're making such a big decision. And then you're going to get the right ballot without having to get the crossover ballot. But if you do want the Democratic crossover ballot, they say it's not a conditional ballot situation. You do not have to surrender the other ballot in order to get the crossover. You just cancel the unused mail ballot and go on, and it should you can cancel the unused mail ballot, and you should be able to just vote, and it's not conditional. So now again with conditional, if you do go into the polling place with your vote by mail ballot, they can cancel it for sure, and you don't become either a provisional or a conditional, and then you can just vote right then because you've surrendered your vote by mail ballot. And I believe that you get into the main batch of ballots, if you will, rather than being set aside. A conditional ballot is not treated as a old provisional ballot. Provisional ballots were counted last to make sure that you hadn't voted before, and it took processing all the ballots before they would process those. And because of that, they were not included in the audits either. But Los Angeles does a very bad job of auditing because they don't include all the later vote by mail ballots anyway. So we're talking about literally hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of ballots that are left out. And to focus on these few provisionals and say that they're not going to be left out is hardly anything to be joyful about, because they probably are going to be still considered the later in that group of the later vote by mail ballots, perhaps. I will say this, though, if you did go to the polling place and you were voted conditional and you were in that first 10 days and you were able to get it into the main process, then you probably would be included in the first audit as well, which is good. Then it says if San Diego is really treating conditionals like provisionals, making their don't know what this is supposed to say there. That is a huge red flag for ballot fraud. This is Mimi Kennedy saying this. So we had this because down here we got alerted. I believe this is from Lauren Steiner, was saying that a poll worker took a screenshot, and it said that SB 207 was passed and signed by the governor, and it says effective immediately, and the text clearly states as long as a person is already registered and wants to change their political party or address, that they make a written request the details. They should not be given a conditional or aka provisional ballot. Well, the things are different. So a provisional and conditional ballots are two different things. A poll worker training appears to be incorrect, and it will mean that more provisional ballots will be given out than is the case. So what they're saying here is as long as a person is already registered and wants to change their party, that they should not be given a conditional ballot. This is what we said before, that if you just want to change your political party, you're already registered, you go into the polling place, because the electronic machines that they're using, they can very quickly change your political party to the different party, and so that you're voting on a different machine. And because they're using what they call electronic poll books, which have a connection back to a central database, so that they know if you, now they have voting centers where you don't have to go to any one center. You can go to one next to your house, you can go to one where you work, or you can go one in between. And this is in Los Angeles and also in some other counties. You're supposed to be able to go to any one of these places and be able to vote. If you have an electronic voting machine, an electronic marking device that they have now in Los Angeles, which basically, once they say this is the type of ballot that you're going to be given, then when you go over to your voting machine, it only displays those options for that type of ballot, your party and so forth. And then, so that would be put into the mix of the main mix. So essentially, if all you need to do is change your party or address, and you should not be given a conditional ballot. And that seems correct. Now, they're saying that the poll worker training had something else that was in it. And so we're having to look into that and see if I can find exactly what that training said. But according to Mimi Kennedy, which is this other things up here, she's been on top of the Los Angeles issue for and very much a long time, and is in favor of the ballot marking devices because of some of the good attributes they have. You can't overvote. It's easy to go to any place. It might actually really help, but there are some downsides. Now, the chain of custody of the ballots, because they don't get scanned and locked into electronic form at the ballot at the polling place. Now we have to worry about, is the paper being secured between the polling place and the central office where they're eventually counted. They do want to do it that way because they're able to do these other types of audits, which are a little bit harder to do without having a machine that will keep track of every piece of paper. I'll go over that a little bit more in a second. So yeah, again, because I failed to record, press the record button when we were doing our conference call, I'm trying to cover the things that we covered here, and maybe in shorter form than we did there. What I want to bring up now is very quickly the latest on, not that one, but the risk limiting audit law is now being recirculated in California for comment, and they did make some major changes in the first go round because originally they were required to only audit one statewide race, which was selected uniformly for everybody, and two county-wide or races within the county or cross county lines, only two other races. And that's an absolute minimalist kind of an audit that no one really liked, nor did it comply with a law that said that they had to do each contest, which seems to mean every contest. So now down here, and I want to outline this again, in terms of contests to be audited, it says here, they shall do so, conduct an RLA on each contest fully contained within its jurisdiction borders, and a partial RLA on each cross-jurisdictional contest partially contained within its borders. So it's sad that they can't use the word all, but really they say each, and that usually means all. And that's actually what the original law says. So these are the, this is not the law, these are like the regulations by the Secretary of State on how it's going to be implemented. The law that was passed actually does say each. And so when it first started, we said, look, it said each, and so you're going to have to do, each means all. You can't say that you're only going to do three, and it says you have to do each contest. The reason that this becomes difficult and why probably, this is the right way to do it, because you want to make sure that each and every contest is actually audited. But the problem is that there can be many, many different contests. And in one county in Wisconsin, and it's not a very large county, the one that I've been working with, it has, I'll show you the ballot here, one of the ballots. And this number up here, 201, is the style of the ballot. And there was, they skip a few. There was over 100 and, well, about 191 different styles of ballot. And by style, I mean you're not going to have you know, all of them had this, just as the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals and the Circuit Court. These were all three on every single ballot. But the rest of them, whether it be the mayor, and this is the mayor of what? Well, this is a ballot of a certain area. It turns out Sun Prairie, the city of Sun Prairie, okay? And so the mayor, they don't say it here, is the mayor of the city of Sun Prairie. Would be kind of helpful if they put that in, but they don't. And so you have to know on this type of ballot, if you get it, you're getting it because you live in Sun Prairie, and so you're only offered the mayor. Well, guess what? The mayor, each mayor of each city does not overlap. So you're going to have these different sets of ballots in these contests. There's something like 320 different contests in their election, but sometimes a few of them are used, and so it mounts up that you have this mayor, that school board, and so forth on different ballots, and you end up with, in this case, 191 different styles. When you come into the polling place, they need to have the style that you know, the exact ballot that you need to vote on. And so that's why in these areas, they do it strictly. You have to go to your polling place to get your ballot. And so now, as I mentioned, in California, they're going to the voting center model, where they're going to have fewer, larger voting centers with more highly trained staff and more resources, so that anybody can go into the voting center and vote and get the proper ballot, because it's through one of these electronic ballot marking devices. If you want to give them an actual hand markable paper ballot like these, then you would have to have them on hand, pre-printed, and it would be a very difficult thing to have all 191 different styles at every single polling place, sufficient to cover what, you know, those random people that might come in. Very, very, you know, nearly impossible. So that's why in Wisconsin they don't use this model. But getting back to the risk limiting audit issue, shrink this back down. There are, and I wanted to mention this, four fatal flaws of risk limiting audit. Here we go. That I want to cover and essentially point out. Risk limiting audits mean that you're going to choose enough ballots and review them statistically so that you can show that the chance that the contest may be opposite of what you say it is would be less than a certain percent, that you're taking a certain risk. Now that risk has to do with the sampling risk, basically. They're offering two types of risk limiting audit in California. The ballot polling audit, this is where samples are drawn from all ballots in the election, and no computer report is required. So essentially, if you walk into a warehouse and you had a whole bunch of boxes of ballots in the corner, and they said, we want you to prove that the election came out right as it is, you don't want to have to recount them all. What you want to do is randomly pull out ballots, and just enough so that you can statistically prove, yeah, there's no way that because I chose them randomly that this would turn out differently. And it has to do with whether your random selection is off or not. So the margin of victory of the sample in this ballot polling audit, this is the one with the boxes in the corner, is compared with the official margin. And they want to keep the sampling error down so that there's the risk that is, like, say, less than 5% that you would be off. The other type is that they're allowing in California is the ballot comparison risk limiting audit. So all ballots must be individually identifiable and matchable to a cast vote record, which is created for each ballot. So this would be the type of thing that they can do in LA if they have the central count situation where they bring the ballots in from these polling places, from ballot marking devices, run it through scanners that can maybe imprint a ID number on each and every ballot. Then keep careful control of those ballots when they're stored. Then when you choose them randomly, if you should actually do it in two directions. You should start with the choosing from the cast vote record and choosing one of those line items, and then going out to the ballots in the center and finding them through what they call a manifest, so you can kind of know where they are. And then the other way to do it is to go into the ballot polling storage area, and based on rows and columns of boxes and how many are in there and maybe some randomization, you choose one of the ballots there, look at that number, and then match it up to the cast vote record. The reason both directions are advantageous is because if the cast vote record doesn't include all the ballots, and there's a whole bunch of ballots in storage, but they're not in the cast vote record, and you only choose from the cast vote record, you're not going to ever notice those missing ballots. And whereas if you chose from the paper and there was extra paper there, then you would potentially choose one of those that is in the paper form, but not in the electronic record. By the same token, if you only chose from the paper and look back to the cast vote record to see if it was there, there may be other entries in the cast vote record that are not in the actual ballot set, and you would never know because you would always be matching to one. So each one of those directions does catch one of the two different types. Unfortunately, they're not planning to do both of the directions here. Let me go over, before I get to that, the thing that they're not doing in California is the batch comparison audit. And this is because they don't want to actually open the door to doing the batch comparison audits that they do now, which is called the 1% manual tally. They don't want to open the door to them being forced to do that correctly. If they did it correctly, they would take batches of ballots, which they already have. They always batch them up into batches of either by precinct or by batch, if it's vote by mail. And then those batches are hand tallied and the tallies compared with the computer report. Now, since you're doing a whole batch at a time and not one ballot at a time, it can be off by more than one vote. It can be off by quite a few votes. And so it's a little bit more complex in terms of how many batches do you need to choose. Most of the procedures that they have now are fairly conservative, and meaning they choose more batches than they absolutely need to in order to get a certain risk limit. But what they do require in these regulations, which I've now turned back to, is that the risk limiting audit has to choose from all of the ballots. So let's go down to that part. So this is where they're talking about the ballot manifest and handling of the ballots. And that then they're going to use this software tool, which we're kind of objecting to because we'd like them to make sure that they use hand-marked tally sheets when they put this in, and not rely upon sort of a electronic device that at the end of the day you don't know if they change the numbers. So we want the tallies to be put down on tally sheets. That's something that they're not doing. And so it says, if the audit commences after all validly ballots have been tabulated, the elections shall create only one ballot manifest, meaning they get to do it only one time. Otherwise, they can create two ballot manifests, one for before each phase of the audit. And then they say no ballots shall be added to the containers included after the manifest. Instead, the tabulated ballots not included in the initial will be moved to the secondary manifest. And they have to have a good chain of custody. That's understood. They choose a random seed. No real problem with that. the audit procedures for a single phase audit. After, this is if all, so they conduct it after all ballots are cast within the jurisdiction have been tabulated and reported. Now this is different than what they're doing now, where they get to just include the initial early vote by mail ballots and not the others. I have a little graphic to show you about this. So, and let me go to, let's see if I can do this. Well, I'll just show you in this small version of it. So in this case, what I'm showing is in these panes here. So there's 4 different panes, if you will, of ballots. And these are the precincts. And in San Diego, there's 1,600 precincts, which are shown in yellow. And those are all the precincts. Actually, they're not quite 1,600. There's 500 and, some 1,500 and something. So didn't quite make it to 1,600. So it's all the yellow ones. Those are the ones at the polling place on election day. But there are early vote by mail ballots and early voting that happen before election day. And then there's a later vote by mail ballots that come in later. They're not late. That should be later. So they come in on time, but they're later than election day. And then provisionals, and now we're talking about conditionals, but the provisionals are the ones that are left to the end. So these that come in on election day and the ones that are considered conditionals, as we've just covered, these black ones are the ones that they randomly chose to tally. And that's in the 1% manual tally that they're using in California now. And they do it, also they can use batches of the early vote by mail ballots, but then they exclude the later vote by mail ballots and the provisionals, which was in the recent elections, 285,000 ballots excluded in San Diego. So what they're changing to now, as we look at in the sheet here, is that if they can do it all at once, then they do include all the ballots. All right. If they're doing a 2-phase audit, then in the first phase, they get to include just part of them. And then in the second phase, then they get to do the final ballot manifest. So essentially, this process that they've outlined here does include, in the risk limiting audit process, all the ballots are supposed to be audited. And that means not necessarily going to look at them all. You're going to sample from all of them. That would be a big improvement if they do this, is that they're going to be, if they follow this law, they're going to be including all the ballots within the that happen in the election. And if they actually follow the law, it'll be done very well in terms of having all of the them, sampled correctly. The problem is they're probably not going to do this correctly because of the problems I'll outline in a minute. But basically, the batch comparison audit is kind of what they're doing now, but they're not doing it rigorously and using the sampling statistics that they should be. They're just saying we're going to do 1% of the precincts, like these black dots that I showed here. So they're going to take all of these, a little bit less than 1,600, and then pick out 16 at random and see how they match up. That's not generally going to be good enough. It needs to be at least, usually that's going to be probably okay for many problems, but at least 14 batches would be enough to catch hacks that corrupt as few as 20% of the batches to a risk limit of less than 5%. It's not too bad, but you have to make some assumptions that the hacks corrupt no fewer than 20% of the ballots for this to be true. So now let me talk about the fatal flaws of risk limiting audits. Number one, the RLAs, the statistical risk limiting audits, become infeasible with tight margins and are worthless for small contests with few ballots. Because, first of all, the first one, if they become tight, let's look at this. Essentially, when you, since this is the only thing we're looking at, let me make this a little bit bigger on the screen. Here we go. So this one here is the ballot comparison RLA. That's where you have every single ballot with a number and you can match it up to the cast vote record. You can see that when the margin gets below 2, then things start to really get big. And these go all the way up to infinity here, or the size of your contest. So by the time you get down to 1 or 0.5%, if it's the contest is that close, you're auditing thousands and thousands of ballots. And this becomes very, very hard. Because what is it? You're going into the cast vote record, finding a ballot, get the number, go out to the paper, which you now need to keep very, very organized so you can find that one piece of paper. And it actually pushes the limits of humans to organize paper. Sounds easy. Oh, we'll just organize the paper so we can find it. But when you get, like in Los Angeles, you have 10 million people that might be voting there that are registered to vote. 10 million pieces of paper is very hard to keep track of. Now, in the ballot polling audit, which is where you have the boxes over in the corner of the room and no cast vote record, and you want to verify that, notice that these curves start to go up at around 10% and really get high. So look at the numbers here. We're already at 5,000. 5,000 isn't even on this graph, okay? So 5,000 is not on this graph at all. It would be up here. And we're already at 5,000. It's the lowest thing possible here, and we're only at 5%. And anything over 10% starts to really get big. So you can see that with this type of audit, you're not going to be able to do it when the contests are really tight. And so that is a fatal flaw. They break down when the contests are tight, and those are the ones who really want to audit. And also, well, here's another point here that this is the good side. Most contests are not that tight. Okay, this is a plot of margins of congressional elections in the last few I guess we're getting everything big. I only want the content to get big and not all bars, but I guess that's the way it does it. So you can see here that the most common margin of victory between the winner and the loser is around 25%. Okay, and there's a lot, maybe a lot more higher than that, and fewer less than that. And when you get down here to 5% or less, it's not that many. Most of them are higher than that. If you look at it this other way, it's how many of the contests are have at least that margin of victory. And you can see that at around 10%, that around 90% of the contests are more than 10%. So very few contests are close, but those are the ones we really need to check. We need to check the ones that I think that are not super close, because anybody that's going to hack it wants to make it at least kind of like a landslide victory, so it won't be really scrutinized too much. But you can only move it so far without it being started to become, suspicious. So I think 2-3% would be about, what you'd want to shoot for if you were a hacker. And still, that 2-3% seems like a lot. When you're talking the actual number of ballots. But it is a very close election compared with all the rest of them. And risk limiting audits just are really bad for those. If you're talking about 2%, 3%, not too bad here, and even closer than that, and these start to get unwieldy. And 2% here, oh man, you're already talking about 25,000 ballots to inspect. That's a lot of inspection. I don't have the charts here for the ballot batch comparison. They're a little bit different because they include more features of the batches that it's not quite as pinned down as the ballot comparison or ballot polling audits. There's a little bit more degrees of freedom about how many errors you can have in a batch and what the margin of victory can be in a batch. And so it's not as cut and dry. So here's fatal flaw number 2. Not all races are audited nor risk limited. So this was the case in the original risk limiting audit proposal in California. They said only 1 statewide race and 2 county races. And that's far fewer than all of the races. So now they're saying each race, and that means every race. And so they're actually not falling into this fatal flaw number 2. Colorado, in their risk limiting audit, they do fall into fatal flaw number 2. They're only doing 1 race, and I believe it's 1 race and the statewide race and one county race. So even fewer than what California was proposing. Now there's a chance that when you choose those races and you actually tally the rest of them, that some of those other contests that maybe have a higher, larger margin of victory would still be covered. So now, moving on to the next flaw, all right, which is that the risk limiting audits are infeasible for auditing many small, non-overlapping contests. True. When you have, by definition, all mayor's races in a county, like you may have many cities in the county. San Diego has all these various cities. Every mayor's race does not overlap with every other mayor's race. Every different water district doesn't overlap with all the other water districts. So when you elect water district people in one water district, and if you correctly audit the number of ballots for that water district, you're by definition not going to be covering that other water district. So in all of these cases, you would have to individually look at each contest and verify, okay, I did get enough samples for drawn randomly from the entire pool in order to cover those little contests. Sometimes if they're very small contests with a very small percentage of voters in them, and if you don't have a better way of sampling than just choosing from everything, being able to choose enough to hit those contests with enough samples is prohibitive. Also, the thing is that the number of samples does not rely on the size of the district very much. It does when you get down to really small. But for the most part, once the districts get large enough, then the number of samples required does not depend at all on how big it is. You could draw samples from, say, a district with, say, 5,000 people is the same, or votes as the same as it was 50,000. You would still have to choose the same number of samples for the same risk. So from that standpoint, as you get a lot of small districts that don't overlap, it becomes infeasible to use these. Let me just cover fatal flaw number 4 and we'll call it a day. Now, the risk limiting audits are complex, difficult, and include innocent fix-up hazards. And this is probably the most important issue that makes risk limiting audits difficult. Risk limiting audits are typically done by the election staff themselves. They're auditing themselves. They are used to fixing problems all day long. And all of a sudden in the audit, they're not allowed to fix the problems. They have to report on all the stuff they did wrong. This is like asking for someone on the freeway, if you go over the speed limit, flag down a police officer and ask for a ticket. Guess how many tickets will be ever given out if you ask that way? No one's going to flag down the police officer. Also, you find that the people doing it don't understand that they're not allowed to correct most of the problems. Sometimes they can, because sometimes the audits need to correct problems that are outside the actual differences in what the ballot says and what the cast vote record says. But in Los Angeles, what you had, and they still do this from what I understand, is they have the original batch of ballots, okay? They make a report of that batch to say, here's what the result is. They compare that with the cast vote record for that batch. I'm going to have to get some new marking pens. They compare that with the cast vote record, all right? And if it matches, they're okay. They go on. But if it doesn't match, they take the batch of ballots and they run it back through again. And then get a new cast vote record going to the second time. And then they compare with the new run. Well, let's say on the first run, somebody went into the disk and changed the values for their contest. You have a guy here who's the attacker, who's an insider, and he changes the values in that contest inside on the computer disk that happened from the original scan. If he changes that, it comes out with a different result. This does not match. Then when they run it back through, it gets scanned again and gives us new result, eliminating the hack. Now they're going to compare and it's going to be okay. This is what they report. So this is the kind of problems that we see with these innocent, if you will, innocent fix-up. I call it innocent because they probably are not thinking that they're doing anything wrong, but they still are. This was the case in Los Angeles where they were fixing this up. That's number 4. We need evidence-based audits with more evidence. This is, we've been told that RLA procedures are the gold standard of auditing, but they are actually insufficient to match what we need out of these audits. And for that reason, we are recommending that election equipment must create ballot images. The ballot images must be properly secured and published. And then ballot image audits should be performed by an independent auditing service prior to certification. And that this takes the election official out of the problem, and because we've got someone else doing it. Districts should use fixed size batch comparison risk limiting audits with approximately 14 batches audited. That is a good type of an audit for batch comparison, and it covers most of the problems and isn't too onerous. They have to include all the ballots in the random selection, not just some of them. And the number 14 doesn't really drop if you have small areas. So they can't choose just one. They're going to have to choose. And if it's a really small area, yeah, it does change. But if it's still a reasonably large area, you can pick this 14 and it'll be about right as long as you get the batches chosen. As long as this is number 14 is if you have all of the contests included on the one ballot at a time, where you don't have all the segmentation. When you have the segmentation, you still got to choose 14 from every little spot, and it's still hard. Okay, so that will end this, and I'm sorry I didn't get everybody else's comments in on our conference call. I just did not press record at the right time. But we'll see you next week. This is Ray Lutz with Citizens Oversight and Recovering Election Integrity. Bye now.